our guest. Welcome to Amir Moini. Welcome to South Park Commons Fireside Chat. Um,
Hi,
of
everybody. Thank you for having me.
course, we're happy to have you. Just here's your boilerplate bio here. Amir Moini is the employer branding lead at Netflix and the author of 22 Life Lessons. Growing up in Boston and now residing in Los Angeles, Amir is also passionate about dance, film, and social media. I've linked to Amir's uh, website in the invite, but I'm going to put it here in the chat. Um, and just to give a little context to everybody here, I encountered Amir's book, um, I'd say in October, maybe or so.
Somewhere around there. Yeah.
Yeah, and just trolling LinkedIn like you do, and I saw this book and I thought, I'll give it a shot, and I ordered it and I gave it a read and I really enjoyed it. So I reached out to Amir and we found out that we both. This is also a shout out to Ashley. Have a Western Massachusetts connection. Um, where Ashley's also from Western Mass.
Oh,
But
that's cool. Small world.
yeah, we both went to UMass Amherst. Shout out to UMass. So that sort of started a friendship, and I just thought Amir would be a great addition for the Fireside Chat series. So that's that's um, that's the background. But Amir, I wondered if you wanted to say anything before we dive in.
No, I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me. I don't know what kind of guests you typically have, but I feel like I'm probably like the least important one. So I'll do my best to just chat about, my personal experiences and the book and any questions you have, and we can go from there. Hopefully you get something out of it. So
I think we will, and that gives us a good transition to Amir's book, which I think would make the first good subject, which is the title is 22 Life Lessons by Someone More Fucked Up Than You.
mhm.
Uh, and that was the cover of the book that I judged. That I went to read it immediately because I thought there's no way. Um, and in any case, I enjoyed your book a lot, Amir, and I essentially saw it as like a self help book, but a more of a personal guide to mental health and how you navigate your world for yourself, and how you try to derive like universal rules from your experience. So I was wondering if you could speak to some of your learnings about mental health that you organized in the book.
Yeah, and it's funny with the title, I wasn't allowed to do advertising for it on Amazon because it had profanity in the title. So if you're ever writing a book, you are restricted heavily in how you can promote it if you have a swear in it. So it's a good learning. But I'd committed to it at that point, so I didn't backtrack. But in terms of mental health, I think the book kind of talks holistically about all aspects of health, whether that's career health, financial health, physical health, mental health. I think there's like so many different avenues. And for me personally, I feel like I've been on this journey of understanding mental health probably for the last like 3 years, even well before COVID, although COVID did not do much to help it. Um, it was really maybe like 3 years ago that I started experiencing depression and having it reoccur, which I think, the first time it happened, it was like, oh, okay, it's circumstantial. But I think once I kind of made it through a bout of it and then it came back again months later, it was like, oh, this might be something that you're always going to have, you're always going to live with. There's going to be ebbs and flows. And I think once I got around to accepting that, I was able to decipher it quickly. I was able to pick up on the symptoms and know what was happening and be able to triage it faster. I think COVID threw it for a loop. I think, at least in terms for me, having emotional stability is related to structure. It's related to um, support, whether that's from friends or family and others. And I think having a situation like COVID where suddenly all your structure is out the window, at least for someone like me, everything I did was usually out of the house. I think that was really challenging where I had to kind of examine and reevaluate, like I had to rebuild essentially, rebuild a whole new life. So if my structure was going to the gym and suddenly I didn't have that, I had to build in ways to work out outside. Or if my structure was family and friends and seeing them, I had to find creative ways to continue that. So it was essentially a reprogramming of my life once everything kind of changed. So I think this book kind of dives into some tips and tricks, but also just my wrapping and understanding of coming to terms with it. As someone who identifies as LGBTQ, in a way, it kind of felt like I was coming out of the closet yet again, like admitting, oh, like I have challenges with mental health, um, and learning to embrace it. I think a lot of people think that it's a negative. They call it, a challenge or things like that. But I try to view it as like when you have anxiety, it's your body's way of communicating to you, and it's your body's way of protecting you because it cares. So when I start to get anxious in moments, instead of getting annoyed or frustrated that it's happening and feeling weak or ashamed of it, I'm like, oh, this is just my body talking to me. And it's doing this because it cares. And it has the best intent. It just doesn't understand like exactly how it's showing up. And there's some like weird comforting feeling about that, knowing that like your mind and your body is like there to support and protect you, and it's just showing up weird. It's just a little bit of a, uncomfortable way of how it's coming together. So that is a very long answer, but that's just some of my understandings, and my journey with mental health. And I think the biggest part is really just learning to embrace it and to be open about it at work. I think I'm very, very candid with my team, and they know that like I need an hour outside every day to like go walk, go run, go work out, to have fresh air. And it's not just a vanity thing. It's like I need that in order to be okay, and they know that. And I think like we have a mental health group at work, which is great. So I think it's just like the more you talk about it, the more normalized it becomes.
Totally, and I appreciate that. I know that mental health is something that a lot of folks in the community at SBC really think a lot about. And while you're talking about acceptance and about self-knowledge, there you reminded me of this quote by Nietzsche where he says, like, "Be careful about expelling your demons because you may be expelling the best part about you."
Mm.
And I think that what you just said speaks to me as a form of like knowing, no, this isn't just what makes you weaker, but it's what makes you stronger in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think all challenges ultimately make you stronger. Um, it's funny because I think a lot of people are probably experiencing mental health challenges for the first time that hadn't prior. And I always say, like, whatever you're feeling right now, it's like, welcome to the club. I've been, this is how I feel every day. But I think it's hard for a lot of people. It's their first time navigating a situation like this, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the world, and that feels like a loss of control. And I think a lot of people don't realize like we're collectively going through a trauma. And I think a lot of times when people hear the word trauma, they think of something like super, extreme, like um, war combat or a really bad car accident. But trauma can be minute as well. And if you don't take the space and time to honor that and to process it, it'll manifest in ways that you may not even be aware of. And I think whether it's all of the protests that are happening and all of the extreme political situations, or whether it's COVID, or like there's so many things that have just happened in the last year, let alone regular life that's already hard enough. I think it's important to carve out time to like allow yourself to process and heal from that, because it has been really traumatic for a lot of people.
Totally, and I think that's part of what struck me about your book was that not only was the book a prescription on how to reckon with trauma and the trauma of everyday life, but it was also evidence of a person who was actively working through it. So I found that as a found document, your book was kind of like, it's an interesting diary of the pandemic. And also what you just brought to my mind was, we use fancy words like trauma, but if you look at the original meaning of the word trauma in Greek, it just means wound.
Mm.
So like what you're saying is like, it's just the wounds of everyday life can be small, it can be big.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good
But
point.
how we approach them is another matter. So let's talk about your writing process then. I wonder if you can sketch um, the path of the idea that you first had to the finish line, like the conception to holding the book in your hand.
Yeah, it looks as if you gave a child a marker and told them to just draw something and it went like everywhere. There's no linear path with it. I tried to write 2 books twice and they went nowhere. The first one was back in 2009 and it was kind of like a collection of poetry and random writings from my journal. And, it was more just like a fun project, didn't go anywhere. And then I was a little more serious about writing a book after doing Teach for America, where I probably got like 40 pages in. And then after that, it just, I don't know, life happened. I got busy. I gave up. And I think I've always been a writer, whether it was like amateur or et cetera. Like I've always enjoyed the aspect of writing. And I think I knew deep down that like at some point I wanted to write something. And I had already written the essay on mental health. I had already written the essay on like my career trajectory. And I was noticing that I was writing an essay format where they were short, they were like 2 to 4 pages or maybe 5 pages. And they were kind of like quick anecdotal autobiographical stories, but like baked in are like ways that you can essentially implement them. And I was like, okay, like I feel like maybe I have something here. And I started to kind of come up with this idea of like life lessons. And then I started doing research and reading a lot of self improvement books or self help books. And I hated almost all of them. I think they were just very annoying in the sense that every author seemed perfect, unattainable, on a pedestal. And it just was like, why am I reading this book by someone that like doesn't really relate to me at all? And that's kind of where I got the idea of like adding more fucked up than you, where it was like, it was kind of like tongue in cheek, where it's like, I'm trying to flip this genre on its head. And it's like, no, I actually have like tons of problems. I'm not this like perfect person, but here's how I navigated it. And maybe like you reading how I did it might help. So I wanted to just be more approachable, I think, and down to earth compared to what I was reading in that genre category. And then from there, I think like once all of that started, it took more shape. I even went back through my journals and back through my prior writings, and I repurposed some of that writing into this book. And my mom actually delivered this like really great sermon at her church, and I I recorded it, and I actually like wrote it down from the video, and that's a chapter in the book where it's like all about like God's tapestry. I'm not very religious, but my mom is more so. So I like that it has these elements of like diverse storytelling, even though it's like not aligned with my beliefs necessarily. And yeah, I think everything just kind of like came together. And then once it was like halfway done, I started committing like, okay, every week I'm gonna write one essay or one chapter. And every time it'd be like in the shower on a plane, like I'd have this new idea for a chapter, or I'd try to write one and it just like it sucked. So I'd get rid of that one and come up with a new one. And the only reason it's called 22 life lessons is because I only had 22 ideas. So there's like no magic to that at all. I think I was like, all right, like these are all the stories that I feel I can share and can tell. And I feel like a lot of them are collectively just like my learnings throughout my 20s. So people always ask, like, is there going to be another book? But I I feel like I probably wouldn't be able to write something till I was like 40 to have like more life lessons learned to chat about. So I don't think anytime soon, at least not in the vein of nonfiction. So
It's funny you should say that you only had 22 lessons, because when I saw 22, I always read extra meaning into everything as the meaning's not there.
yeah.
Um, there's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and 22 in Hebrew is double 11, which means disorder and chaos. So I
Exactly what I was going for.
right.
Yeah.
How to overcome chaos by Amir
Like
Moini.
you, yeah, that was exactly it. So
Mazel tov. Okay. Well, so another phrase that leapt out to me, what you just said, was diverse storytelling. Your integrating of your mother's voice into your book as diverse storytelling, and I don't think of a better buzz phrase or catchphrase than diverse storytelling for Netflix. And you're at Netflix now. You started out as a recruiter, right?
yeah.
And now you're in employer branding. So t- tell us a little bit about what you do in your role, and how that's evolved.
Yeah, so I've been at Netflix for about 5 years now, and before working at Netflix, my career is primarily in nonprofit work, and I worked at the Los Angeles LGBT Center, where my job was actually to manage corporate clients. So being in LA, your corporate clients are either tech or entertainment primarily. So my job was to go into a room and to walk out with like $100,000 check. And that was essentially, I'd ask people for money, either people or organizations. And I always say, once you can ask people for money, you can literally ask for anything else. It becomes really easy to ask for favors and ask for help. So, like, I think having that background in development really was helpful in everything else I did moving forward, because you have to have this, like, I don't know, like sense of confidence slash humility to be able to have those awkward conversations around money. And yeah, Netflix was one of my partners for about a year and a half, and I really liked them. I really admired the Pride ERG group that they had, and I obviously love movies and TV. I've been a huge fan. I was, the dream job as a kid was to be a movie critic, so I was a huge movie buff. And after a while, I eventually met with the leads of the ERG, and I was like, "Hey, I, want to make the transition into corporate. I know that I want to work in entertainment, and Netflix seems like the one place that I would want to work." I was like, "I just don't know where to get my foot in the door. So, how do I do this?" And I had coffee with a few people, and every kind of conversation led to recruiting, because recruiting and development fundraising are very similar. It's all about relationship building, networking, convincing people to invest in something. So there was an entry level role supporting public relations and marketing that I went for, and I ended up getting it. And I think the reason my former boss hired me is because I had a diverse experience that other people didn't. Most people were recruiters at other tech companies, entertainment companies. Here I am, this random person with no experience in recruiting, but I had a tenacious spirit, and I came from nonprofit and I was scrappy. So she was like, "I'm going to take a bet on him." And a year and a half of doing recruiting led to this opportunity in employer branding where no one was doing it. And employer branding is essentially you're creating a brand and you're telling stories around what it's like to work at a company. So you have Netflix, which has its brand for consumers, right? It's around like the titles and the talent, et cetera. But then you also have the story of what it's like to work at Netflix and to see Netflix as an employer, as a potential employer for you to go to. So that's my job, to essentially tell those stories. And what that details is I manage Netflix's LinkedIn page. I manage the We Are Netflix social channels and brand, the We Are Netflix podcast, the job site, and then working with different teams and leaders on how they can build their personal brands, like best practices for social media, best practices for teams, conferences. So it's a lot of creative work, which I appreciate. It's a lot of video production, podcast production, blogs, social media, but owning everything from like start to finish, which is great. So essentially this function was created. I was able to hire someone, and then eventually the two of us, we went from recruiting to communications about a year and a half ago. So now we sit on the comms team, and now we're doing a lot more work focused with like press and reporters. So it's evolved a little bit, but it's still an employer branding function essentially.
I think it's really interesting. I would love to hook you up with, here we have DRIs, directly responsible individuals. I'd love to hook you up at some point with well, our former DR, or current, but soon to be former DRI in storytelling, which I think is probably the closest thing we have to branding at SBC, Nick Arioli. I'd love to hook you up and one day and have coffee with you and talk about more about branding, because I know you're passionate about it. I think we need more good brands, right?
Yeah,
So
I
um,
would love to.
uh, I think that's really interesting, how you made that leap. And I guess I wonder then, in jumping from there, like, how does your professional life and that sort of a microscopic look at the jump you made there relate to the odyssey of, like, even getting to LA in general? Because I know you're not from there. And what were the stepping stones along the way that brought you to even be in the position to make that leap?
Yeah, I mean, after I finished Teach for America, after college, so it's 2 years, and I did it in Hawaii, which was a very unique experience. And after that, I had no clue what I wanted to do. I was like, what am I doing with my life? Like, what's next? I know I don't want to really be like a teacher forever. I feel like the public education system broke my spirit in wanting to do that. And I just decided, I went home for a few months and then I bought a one-way ticket to LA with like a few $1,000s in my savings. And like the minute I hit LA, I was like in a suit riding the bus for 2 hours from Hollywood to Santa Monica to like network at this event. I was having coffees like left and right with people, and it was always coffees because I couldn't afford meals. I was volunteering at galas because you essentially can get into the room with all the people that can afford a $2,000 ticket. And then you just like network the shit out of the room. It was a lot of hustling at the time. And I was working like 4 internships, um, 2 volunteer jobs, 3 part-time jobs. One of my jobs was standing outside of Whole Foods asking people to donate to money. It was like the worst position ever. Um, and yeah, just like you like there was no other way to do it. I didn't come from a background where, I had a parent that could give me money. And um, my dad was pretty middle class, but very strict and like refused to help. He was just like, you got to do it on your own. My mom comes from like very lower class, and she, even if she wanted to, she couldn't. So I think I just didn't have any other options. It was just kind of like sink or swim. And I actually got to the point where I had like $20 in my savings account. It was like, and I had no credit card at the time either. So like if anything happened, I was screwed. And I specifically remember like it was like one night I was taking the bus and I missed the bus and my phone died and it started downpouring and I like walked like 7 miles in the rain from like midnight to 3 a.m. And the next day I got a job. And that was kind of like, the salary was like $30,000. And that led me to the LGBT center and that led me to Netflix. And it's just been like everything kind of like was a layer of sediment that like laddered up into the next step. And if it wasn't for that one time where I like landed and took a suit and went to that event, I wouldn't have met this one guy that introduced me to another guy that got me the job at the LGBT center. So like everything was like interconnected. And I always say like when I look at some of the biggest reasons why my life changed, it was usually because of very, very, very small detail that like I could have easily overlooked. I think of like one of the most successful video campaigns we had at Netflix was like just this like small nugget of an idea, and I almost passed on it, but I didn't. And I think it's like it's always those like little things that can ultimately blow up into something great. Even like me publishing this book led me to meet Aiden, led me to have this conversation, um, channeled me into like writing fiction again and getting back into like potentially like screenwriting and things. So I think like everything kind of ladders and has like a stepping stone effect.
Well, I love that, and I think that that's part of what appealed to me about what you wrote was you're so hardworking. I mean, two quotes come to mind out of that, which is the great classic quote from Britney Spears: "You want a Maserati, you want a
You better
sexy
work,
body, you better
bitch.
work, bitch." Right, and then there's also Tupac Shakur's. all good things come to those who stay true, you
Mhm.
know, and so that's what I see in you as a work ethic, and also a sort of integrity, a staying true to yourself, which uh, um, is hard to do, as we all know. You know, I mean, we're all out there trying to be true to ourselves, and that's what I like in the humility of what you wrote. And so then I want to say what I've noticed, something that you do from your book, and then just becoming friendly with you afterwards. Just for the community here, Amir and I have never met in person. It's such a COVID
Never.
friendship. We're just like Google Hangouts buddies. Um, but something you do, I've noticed, is you, and this is something that's a part of the ethic of South Park Commons, is what South Park Commons says: dive into the deep end, you know, or immersing yourself in a world that you don't know at all, like just going from just down to zero. The great Betty Levette soul song, "Down to Zero," or Joan Armatrading, "Down to Zero." So, can you talk to me about how does it happen that you jump in with something we don't know how to do it at all, and you just do it?
Yeah, I mean, I want to go back to one point you said around like being yourself. And one thing I've learned is your funnel of likability dramatically decreases the more you are your authentic self. And you have to get real good at like people maybe not agreeing or understanding you, because I think a lot of times we code switch to fit in, right? If maybe we don't think something is as exciting as another group on our team member, but we'll still respond the same way to save face or to show face. And I think the more I've learned to really like be my authentic self, I've become much more of an acquired taste, which I've like, at first I was like, oh, what's wrong with me? Like, why don't people, some people don't see eye to eye, and I think it doesn't mean they don't like you. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that maybe they're uncomfortable by it. And I think the more you channel, really diving into like who you authentically are and presenting that, you're going to have to also, um, come to terms with the fact that people may not respond the way you want them to, and that's okay, but it's a side effect of it. So just wanted to share that observation I've had in this journey for the last few years. Diving in the deep end, I mean, that's been like a theme, which is like every single job I've done up to this point, or even like hobbies or side projects like writing this book, I've never had any experience. And I think it's starting to give me this like false sense of confidence where there's going to be a time where I think I can do something and I absolutely like, I'm like, oh, being a doctor, like, I guess if I just like try, I can figure that out too. So
Put that
I,
UMass education to good use.
yeah, exactly. But I think, whether it was like learning to be a math teacher and being horrible at math, I would literally stay up all night and teach myself algebra and algebra 2, and trig and so forth, like on YouTube videos with something called Khan Academy. I would teach myself the night before and then teach my kids the next day. And I had no experience teaching. I knew nothing about Hawaiian culture, and it was just like it was like the extreme situation of being thrown into the deep end where it's not even just my livelihood at stake, it's like children's education, where I don't take that lightly. And after that, it was working in, nonprofit fundraising, again, no experience in that. And then it was recruiting, no experience in that. And then employer branding and building a whole function, no experience in that. Comms, no experience. Writing, no experience. So I think what I've learned is like, for the most part, we all have a human instinct to survive. So if you get thrown in the deep end, like you're most likely going to swim and you're most likely going to figure something out, even though it's going to be a really bumpy, uncomfortable ride. However, that being said, even if you don't and you fail and you mess up dramatically, like you're still going to learn so much from that. And it's going to be a really humbling experience too. um, there's been moments that I've like really failed as well, and they suck in the moment. But I think like when you look at it a year later, you're like, oh, I'm really glad that happened the way it did, and I learned a lot from that. So I think it's not comfortable, and there's definitely a day where I hope like I can just ease into the kiddie side of the pool. That would be refreshing. It's a lot less energy. Um, but I'm kind of just like, this seems to be my fate. So I'm just like, I'm here for the ride. And I don't really try to like steer hand it too much. Every opportunity has kind of been organic, and I've never had to like really like intentionally fight to carve out a path. So right now I'm kind of in this weird like funk where I'm like, okay, I've been at Netflix for 5 years. I don't really know what's next, but I'm not really like actively looking. I'm just trusting that like the next opportunity is going to open up and I'm going to know when to take it. So
Well, what I hear from what you're saying is that there's a degree of like trusting in the unknown. And I know a lot of founders here, Santi among others here, starting their own um, startups here. That there's that inevitable kind of feeling of like sinking feeling of sink or swim, right?
mhm.
And and so I think that that's another thing that I respond to in your work is that you model a kind of courage, and I appreciate that. So I'm also including in the chat. This is just pure self-indulgence. A link to the great Betty Levette, Soul Singers, "Down to Zero," which is a song that you reminded me of, which is to be listened to afterwards, about what happens when you get the rug pulled out from under you and suddenly have to swim. So on that note, I guess I want to ask some other members of the community. Let's open it up to a open forum Q&A. Any questions that you have for Amir, or things you want to chat about?
Yeah, Amir, thank you so much for coming to chat with us. It's really great. Um,
Of course.
yeah, we had a separate forum where we actually read Netflix's employee handbook, and I was a really inspiring document
Mhm.
for a variety of reasons. I myself have a disability and I'm a filmmaker, and I'm actually about to start looking for distribution for my first feature film. But I was wondering if you just maybe talk about how Netflix embodies the employee handbook from like your perspective.
Yeah, and I think you're probably referring to the culture memo, which I can send to Aiden to send out if you're curious to read it. Um, it is like 96% accurate with like 4% margin for human error. I think when I first read it, I was like, okay, this is cute, but like, how many people actually do this? Like, is this real? And then, I got into the company and I was like, wow, this is like really surprisingly accurate. And like everybody kind of like upholds the values. And um, like, when you're in high school and you do a group project and there's one person that does all the work, there's one person that like shows up like half-ass, and then there's two people that do nothing. That like never happens when I at Netflix. Everybody is the person that shows up 100% and does amazing work. And I think because we have this culture of like giving feedback in real time, there's never situations where, little situations are swept under the rug and then tension builds up and then you don't want to collaborate with someone and there's like politics and withholding of information. Like that almost never happens, and it's so refreshing. Netflix is my only corporate company, so I can't compare to other places. I'm sure a lot of startups have similar work cultures and tech as well. So I don't think it's necessarily the only company that has a culture like that, but at least for me, I find it like very refreshing. And I think I've always been described as a bull in a china shop at other places, but at Netflix, I like perfectly fit in and it's not too much, which is nice. So yeah, I like it. I've never been bored one day, and I've worked there for 5 years. So that says a lot. Like every day is like new and challenging, and the minute I start to kind of get bored, my role changes and my work changes. So I think inclusion is like such a thread point throughout everything that we do. We recently launched our first inclusion report, and all of our learnings of like the last 2 years in terms of really creating a diverse and supportive work environment. And we obviously have lots of room to grow and to improve, but I think what I'm seeing internally is like really refreshing. And we have a team of 17 people that are dedicated to that, whereas most companies have teams of like 3 or 4. So they're all embedded in different areas of the business. So I feel like I can truly be myself. And I think everybody like walks the walk in addition to talking the talk.
That's awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
To piggyback off that before we get another question, Amir, and I haven't seen it yet, Owen, but you might be curious just on a personal film lover level, Amir, that Owen has directed a horror film.
Oh, cool.
Well, not directed, actually wrote and produced and acted in, and
Right.
a colleague directed it, called Angels of Mercy, and it's been like a labor of love, and if I may say so, Owen, a labor of pain,
Absolutely.
making this film, and so just as I know you also have a soft spot for horror movies, Amir. I think that when I watch Angels of Mercy, finally, I definitely want to be in the presence of Amir. We watched it. So,
I would love to see it. I love horror movies. It's my favorite genre. So,
Nice.
yep.
I wonder if anybody else in the community has a question that they want to pose to Amir here.
Yeah, I'll just throw it out there. I'm curious to hear a little more about what you do at Netflix. I read the title and I'm of course putting many thoughts into what it probably means on the day to day and what kind of impact does it have in the company. But as an entrepreneur myself, building my own culture, uh, my own brand, I'm curious to hear firsthand how would you describe yourself and how would you try to fulfill those responsibilities in an early stage company.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it'd be easier if I applied a specific project to show what I do as like a, case study almost. So as I mentioned, we just came out with Netflix's first inclusion report, where when you look at most companies that do it, they usually release like a pretty dense PDF. It's like 20 pages and it's like very nitty gritty, focused on like metrics, etc. And we decided that we wanted to change the way we come out with our learnings and have it be more storytelling. So we created a 10-minute short film, and that focused on like more anecdotal case studies of like specific people that like came and did amazing things in the space of inclusion, even if it wasn't necessarily their full-time job. And the whole theme of the film is that inclusion unlocks innovation. If you get more people into the door that come from all different backgrounds, like that's where the magic happens. And if you combine that with a culture like Netflix, where you hire smart people and you get the hell out of the way, it's even better because they're able to do like amazing things. A good example of that is a director in HR came up with the idea of moving $2 million of our capital into Black banks. He has no, experience in finance, but he came up with this idea. He emailed our CFO. Our CFO was like, let's do it. And then it just happened. And, we worked with like press and reporters to launch that story. So in addition to making the film, we also wrote like a really extensive blog report. We created a video that had metrics, but we actually worked with Black artists to like create animations that all centered around this theme of like sowing seeds, where you invest in people and they eventually bloom. And we wanted it to feel like a lot more artistic rather than corporate. And after we, had the video and the blog, then it's also like your launch and your execution. So we launched it on Netflix's LinkedIn page, all the social channels. You have to come up with like really interesting thumbnails and copy. And we created 60-second versions of the videos to live in different areas. And then we also did like 20 interviews with our head of inclusion. So we worked with like Bloomberg, CNN. We worked with Forbes, Fast Company, like tons of media outlets essentially. And then all on the same day at the same time, there's an embargo where they release their articles. So it was like a 360 approach where you have the film, you have the blog posts, you have the social channels, you have all of the press and the news. And, that's all kind of like one collective campaign. And that's an example of like one project that I work on. So it's all stories around inclusion, around Netflix employees, around the work culture. Another big topic that we're going to be looking at is like sustainability, for example. or like the inclusivity of our benefits. So there's all different types of stories along those veins.
That's very cool. It sounds almost like it's really a marketing role where the thing being marketed is Netflix as an employer and not as a product.
Essentially, yeah, except I have a rule that like I will never tell lies. So everything that I work on is the truth. At least truth is subjective, but I try to be as truthful as possible, essentially. Like we never want to paint a false portrayal. So
Nice.
yeah.
We should have a philosophical discussion one day whether or not truth is subjective, Amir. But I'm only, perhaps I'm joking. I don't know. I want to point towards Reed Hastings and Aaron Meyer's book "No Rules Rules," the book about the corporate philosophy of Netflix, which came out in what, November?
Yeah.
Amir,
That was another project like we worked on, essentially. Like we were the lead marketers for that book. So we came up with like all of the, when Reed did a podcast, he did the We Are Netflix podcast. And then we created a video called like Top 5 Lessons that he learned as CEO of Netflix. And we translated it into 23 languages and like launched it around the world. And so that was like another project that we did.
and congratulations on that too, Amir, because I read that book. I listened to it on Audible actually. And
Nice.
I think for anybody who's starting a company like Santiago or all the myriad others at SBC, that's just a great example of how I think from what I perceived, they tried to roll out their standards and practices. They tried to roll out their philosophy and the whole history of the genesis of Netflix. So
actually, obviously there's some bias because I work at Netflix, but I really liked the book. I think when I first got it, I was like, oh, this is like long. I don't know if it's going to be stuffy. But when I read it, it was like, I read it in 2 days. And I thought it was really interesting because they use a lot of like storytelling elements and case studies rather than like telling you what to do necessarily.
Well, I agree. For those of you who haven't read Reed Hastings and Aaron Meyer's No Rules Rules, I think it is a great book because it has that balance of Aaron Meyer as a journalist, almost as a think of The Great Gatsby, Nick Carraway, who's on the outside looking in on Gatsby on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
Myers on the outside, Hastings on the inside. And this balance between the two of them, their dialogue, results in a really good humored and self-effacing story of their trials and errors, and ultimately, all the meaning that they mined out of this idea that, hey, if we're radically honest with our employees, and if we have that reciprocity and that mutuality between team members, then we'll strike gold. And I mean, I don't think you have to look any further than stock exchange, let alone your own watching habits to see that they're successful, or just how well they retain employees. Maybe you can speak to that, Amir. I mean, it seems like people are generally pretty satisfied.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have any info on like retainment numbers, but I will say that, we have about 7,500 employees. And if you compare that to other companies, I mean, Facebook is probably like in the hundreds of thousands. And to me, their brand notoriety are almost the same. Their impact and influence are somewhat close, I would say. Facebook maybe more. And it's like at the end of the day, their philosophy is like hire one really amazing person, pay them competitively, and they can do the work of 5, average people, essentially. And then when you feel like you're being paid your worth and you're in an environment where everybody's high performing, naturally you are enjoying it and you want to stay. So
Curious to hear, how do you how does your team measure its performance, and what kind of metrics do you use to justify budget, sell projects, is there a metrics or a OKR driven approach, or is it really uh, just a more subjective, let's invest and know that it will work regardless?
I think metrics and data, it's a double-edged sword. I think it's good to guide, but not good to be wholly dependent on. So I would say it's like mostly art, a little bit of science. I think a lot of social media, a lot of that kind of creative work is judgment and intuition that's built up over years of, a pulse on culture, pop culture, world events, what's resonating with people, showing up on all different platforms and seeing what people are talking about. For example, like Clubhouse is like the next thing. I mean, if you aren't already on it, it's like an amazing social platform that's super interesting and primarily BIPOC communities. And like that to me is like the future of social. So that is like a very, very interesting platform that we're already talking about. Like, how do we show up in there? And how do we have our executives and leaders of teams like do seminars in Clubhouse to essentially drive more recruiting? So I think, there's some metrics, obviously, like you can look at impressions, you can look at engagement rate, you can look at views, like those are all the social metrics. And having, comparisons is great. You can be like, okay, well, like if normally the average engagement rate is 2%, and then this one is 5 or 6, it's like, why is this one performing higher? And we always do this like activity at the end of the year where we pull all posts from our LinkedIn channel that has 1 million impressions or higher. And we do like a deep dive and we analyze them and we try to bucket them into categories and themes of like, okay, these are the top 10 posts of 2020. Like, how do we do more of these? Why did they resonate with people? Like, what are the common characteristics of these 10 posts that essentially show like, this is what performed most successfully to our users and followers. And then I think when it comes to like these big campaigns like No Rules Rules, or when it comes to like the inclusion report, it's like partially like what are people saying? Even if you get like lots of impressions, but everyone's like, oh, this sucks. It's like, is that a win? I don't think so. So to me, it's like if people are watching the inclusion report film and they're like, wow, Netflix is really like leading the way when it comes to inclusion, and this made me feel seen and made me feel heard, that to me is like amazing. And that's the kind of story that we want and the reactions that we want people to have. So I think it's also like, what's the sentiment overall, like based on social commentary, and then also how much like media and press are covering it. If you have a good story and people are covering it, that says a lot too. So
Any questions from anybody else in the community before we wrap up in our last 10 minutes?
Yeah. Thanks for the talk. Really enjoyed it so far. I am curious to hear your thoughts on any potential trade-off between companies that are more sort of intense and companies that are less self-aware from a sort of inclusiveness perspective. Maybe like Uber in the dark days was a poster child of like probably not that inclusive and also very sort of hard driving. Do you see it as like things that are opposed that have to be balanced, or maybe at Netflix being so open as a way of actually enhancing the degree of inclusiveness, if that makes sense?
yeah, I mean, this isn't my area of expertise, so I want to obviously tread lightly in like speaking on behalf of things that I don't oversee. But I would say like, I think the inclusion lens is part of high performance. It's like expected that if you're a leader of a team, if you're an executive, you need to be very educated in this space. And if you don't have that element, you're probably not going to be successful or hired. Like it's a prerequisite to work at Netflix to be educated in this space and to know how to show up in this work. So, and I think also because there's a culture of like, you can have really tough conversations regardless of title. That allows people to have those uncomfortable conversations where like building an inclusive environment is usually like not a smooth path. Like it's uncomfortable, it's awkward, it's tough. Like these conversations are hard to have. And I think our environment encourages those because you don't have like fear of repercussions, essentially. You know, there's been so many times where I've given like a random VP feedback and like I don't even bat an eye doing it because I know that that's like encouraged. So I think there's this element of like, you don't have to worry about what's going to happen if you give feedback to someone, as long as you're giving it the right way and you're receiving it the right way, right? There's kind of like judgment in how you do that in a mature way. But I think it's encouraged, which is healthy. So I don't necessarily think that high performance and inclusion are against each other. I think an inclusion lens is a part of high performance.
Love it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question? Well, in that case, I should add, by way of context, I guess people in the community might know by now that I'm a fairly effusive person. I tend to say, wear my heart on my sleeve. But we are at SBC having a fasting squad. So like some of us are fasting right now, and I'm one of them. So maybe I'm a little lightheaded and I probably shouldn't have had any whiskey, but there's a poem by a teacher of mine that reminds me of you, Amir. I'm putting in the chat, by Miri Hutcherson. So I wanted to read it to you and offer it to the community real quick before I give Amir the last word. And I think that this speaks to a lot of the ideas that we spoke of and of the friendships that I have at SBC and the new friendship that I have with Amir. Motion Pictures by Miri Hutcherson. I watch you leave, you drag the dark along into the street, your face toward the marquee, still wearing the unguarded feelings it lifted from the calm conspiracy of tendon and breath that arms it in lighter hours, that keeps its courtesy. The stars don't mind, it's rude not to stare here, not to feel quick as I feel near you, turn to go, and the birds that live under my tongue rise delighted from the quarters of my blood. My gasp, laugh and grasp, now I know, now credits where they are due. The roll, see how careful with each toe in each shoe, each eyelash and buckle, each bridge, brace, and tree, spoon, lip, and sign. Bless you. Blanket, mirror, coin, cloud, how little of it belongs to me, only the fantasy, and that only because you gave it to me. So that's how I feel. You gave it to me, Amir. You're a great example.
Oh, thank you. I like the poem. Thanks for sharing.
You're welcome. Anybody have any last words, or I'll turn it over to Amir?
Yeah, I was gonna say thanks again, Amir. I sent you a link and I'd love to connect at some point.
Yeah, thank you. My LinkedIn is I'll leave that as well as the link to the book if anyone is interested. But just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity to meet all of you and get to chat a little bit about my life experiences and opinions and so forth. So I had a good time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amir.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank
See you.
you.
Ciao.
Just to let you know, Amir, this was recorded, but it'll only be shared internally.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.
You see, all.
Bye.